Let's start. I've got to apologize for already getting us behind schedule. So our first speaker is Professor Zhang. He is a professor and director of East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore, and he's edited several books and publications. So, Professor Zhang.
Thank you, Chairman. Also, thank you for inviting me to this event. Well, yesterday, Joe told me my paper is the longest. I forgot to tell him when I prepared the paper, I took the jet lag impact into consideration. Now it's early morning in Singapore. My brain doesn't work well. So in case I cannot make myself clear or make myself understood, you have to refer to my paper. So basically, my paper, Joe asked me to look at the central local relations because I have been looking at this issue for 1 decade, actually. And basically, it's a review of the development of central local relations in China. I just want to make a few points. And basically, the scholarly community has been talking about China authoritarian system and what was the different terms. But when you talk to Chinese government or government officials, they feel they never get enough power. Somehow, authoritarianism without authority. Now, this is especially now true. And before, now even in China, and people talk about, before people talk about political order will not go beyond the city of Beijing, but now they're talking about the political order will not go beyond Zhongnanhai and China's White House. So that's in China. There also was a saying, and the 天高皇帝远 is the sky is high, the emperor is far away. And if you go to China's rural area, you never feel, and there is a government there. And besides, well, of course, the government people will come to collect tax or revenue, but besides that, and no government. So I wanted to review the development of central local relations in the 80s. And I think China's reform was characterized by intergovernmental decentralization under Deng Xiaoping and Zhang Ziyang. That strategy was very effective. The central government decentralized economic decision-making power, resource to local government at the different levels. That provide a great incentive for local government to develop their economy. Then early on, and Barry talked about, and the government is a performance indicator, and the central government evaluate local government officials and by taking into their economic performance, basically growth rate. But I think that I would say why it's effective because of the overlapping of central interest and local interest, and because the local government can get a lot of benefit from local economic growth. But that system doesn't work now when the government is trying to shift its focus from economic development to, for example, to a more environmental friendly development model. Because, for example, and this healthcare education, because the local government official certainly cannot get the benefit from this sort of thing. So now I think it's changing. But anyway, and intergovernmental decentralization led to very high economic performance. There's a huge body of literature I don't want to go over. But nevertheless, because that intergovernmental decentralization led to decline of central government physical capacity, as scholars like Wang Shaoguang and Wei Gang indicated. And also, relatively independent from each other among the Chinese provinces. And several World Bank report found especially some of the Chinese provinces, especially the coastal provinces, they highly rely on the world market, and they are less integrated with the rest of the country, and the degree, the interdependence rate between China provinces is lower among the EU states, even lower among the Soviet Union states under Soviet Union. So that led to what I call selective decentralization under Zhu Rongji government in the middle 1990s. And for example, Zhu Rongji did some wonderful decentralization work. For example, the new taxation system called Feng Sei Zi, also central banking system reform, all kind of things. So also politically, of course, and the political decentralization. Basically, the central government tightened the personnel appointment system, those things. In recent years, actually, after Wu Jintao and Wen Jiabao came into power, there has been a full scale of decentralization, and it seems the central government is decentralized everything to its own hand. When whatever bad thing happens, the central government just grab power. For example, environmental issues, healthcare, energy, all kind of in all those fields, the central government now those powers are very high centralized. As a consequence, I would say, and in 1992, Wang Shaoguang and Wei Gang published their report, so-called state capacity, and I have, discussed it with him many times. I would say, well, what your proposal at that time, of course, was a wonderful idea, at least to justify your report, justify what Zhu Rongji did at that time. But now, if you look back, actually, you can see it's a failed state capacity. At least, state incapacity. Why? If we look at in physical terms, of course, the central government is so powerful now. In the past more than 1 decade, the central government, the revenue of central government has increased every year, double digit. And I think it's the fastest in this world. But meanwhile, and the income disparities, like Carl mentioned, also has been widening continuously. That means the central government was not able to stop widening income disparities, although physical despite the physical centralization. Also, a lot of, as I mentioned, and the different area, environmental issues, food safety, production safety, food security, all kinds of things. And of course, the government did so in order to build a so-called regulatory state. But nevertheless, I don't think it's working, and China still doesn't have a good, effective regulatory system, and still a lot of bad stories like this milk scandal and all kinds of things. That means, especially in my paper, I have a table. A lot of local government actually now almost broken, are serious in debt because all money now, most of money goes to the central government, not the local government. I mean, the central government decentralized physical power. Nevertheless, it did not take any responsibility. So there is a huge gap between policy making and the policy enforcement. And the central government makes all policies. But when you come into policy enforcement, because this is, policy enforcement, needs money, and the central government will certainly ask the local government to finance those policies. So that's a major problem, and if you go to, of course, like Guangdong and Shanghai and all those rich provinces, they don't want to follow, to take policy order for the central government because they are rich enough. They are quite autonomous. They want to make their own policy, they have money to enforce their own policy. Then in poor provinces, of course, they don't have enough money to implement the central policy. So somehow I would say, and there have been a de facto, both central government and the provinces have de facto veto power. They can veto each other's policies. That's actually very serious in China. In recent years, the central government, of course, has been able to establish a pro-people image, and trying to implement a pro-people policy package. But many local governments, when I talk to them, they feel they are demonized by the central government, because that's the Chinese tradition. Well, the emperor is good, the people is good, the bad guy always in the middle, right? So, but eventually, because the central government has to ask local government officials to do the job. So a lot of problems with the local government. They don't have money and they don't have incentive, to enforce central policies in rich provinces. Don't have capacity to enforce central policy in poor provinces. That's the problem. Then I would say, and in my opinion, I have a few cases to see why the central government failed its so-called state capacity to get something done. For example, like the SOE, state-owned enterprise reform. I think it's in the middle, in 1997, 1998. I think Zhong Ji had a wonderful program of SOE reform called 抓大放小. That means to reorganize big SOEs following the South Korea or Japan model in order to increase China's competitiveness in the international market. Then, of course, for 放小, that means to privatize China's media and small enterprise. But both are failed. And 抓大, I mean, well, those international, those big SOEs, they are not competitive, still not competitive in international market, but I mean, they turn to domestic market. That means they do a lot of monopoly. So that's in China, you can see a lot of monopoly in this company, and at the central level, then provincial level, city level, county level, even township level. So at the central level, of course, you can justify, because every state has its national interest, strategic consideration. Well, that's a monopoly. You can say, big like oil company or steel company, you can justify it. But when you come down to provincial level or county level, city level, those monopoly are not justificable, because wherever the business become profitable, then the government SOE will go. That means China's China's SMEs, the SMEs do not have actually a good environment to grow. That's also one of the factors why now so many small and medium enterprise bankrupted. Another case is that means. This is central initiative, but the central government was not able to enforce, to implement, because of local resistance, because of local government changed the policy initiative. Then this morning, we talk about this local election. The same. That's the initiative from bottom, from society. Nevertheless, the central government was able to veto this initiative. I don't want to go to detail, because we already talked about it. I don't think any local election or local democracy will go up, or never. Also, look at another case, NGOs. Well, yes, China now has a lot of NGOs, but if we look at the politically, in some areas like social development and like charities, of course, the government encourages NGO to perform their function. But when you come to political area or religious area, there's no way for NGO to become legal even. So this kind of thing I would call, and both local government and central government, they can veto each other. That's a serious problem. So solution in the future, I would say, and the central government really has to, you decentralize power, but you have to decentralize power to society. That's the problem. That's the only solution, I would say, because the power so far has been actually sometimes transferred between among the different levels of government. So when power is too centralized, then local doesn't have initiative. When power is too decentralized, then you have a lot of local dictators. And the society still doesn't have power. So you really have to decentralize power from local government to society. That's the solution. Also, another thing I think the central government has to do is to re-centralize. Also, it's a responsibility. You take money from society, away from society, from local government, then you don't take any responsibility. That's also not the issue. The better story is, the Wu Jintao and the Wen Jiabao government for past 5 years, since 2002, they have been talking about a lot about the social security or all kind of things, but they haven't done anything serious. Because the problem is the central government has lots of money for social reform. Of course, social reform needs a lot of money. The central government has this amount of money, but the problem is that they're not able to spend this money because those money now are in the hand of vested interest. If you think about healthcare reform, and a lot of debate, a lot of report by different organizations, by DRC, by Ministry of Finance, but all those different kind of interests. They're arguing each other. They don't want to release money. They don't want to give money back to society. That's I think is a problem. But anyway, I would say, and China is especially the communist system is a class-driven system. Without a major crisis, nothing will change. And so hopefully, this financial crisis will become a motivate and to motivate the central government to do something meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you. My understanding is we hold questions till the end. Yeah. Okay. Then our next speaker is Professor Liu, and he is director of. Oh, sorry. And he is the founding director of the Hsph China Initiative at the Harvard School of Public Health. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for putting together this remarkable commemorating event. 1978 was the year I went to college. So to me, this has been a personal as well as professional experience. What a ride, a lot of flashbacks. And of course, I can talk about health and healthcare issues for hours. And believe me, the Chinese healthcare system is as broken as the American system. But you are referred to a recent Lancet, one of the leading medical journals in the world, series on China, including my paper on China's health system performance. But I thought it would be more interesting for this audience if I can focus not on the health policy issues themselves, but on the political economy aspects of the policy-making process. So my the reform, the title of the presentation is China's Experiment with Healthcare Democracy. So I am basically pretending someone I'm not, that is a political commentator, to be more provocative. One of the fundamental questions addressed by this conference is, has China become and will she continue to be a wealthier and healthier nation? I think the answers to the first question is definite yes, while the answers to the second one are much more ambiguous and requires much more nuances. Over the past 30 years, despite China's remarkable economic growth, a healthcare crisis has been looming in the country. The SARS fiasco, constant threat of avian flu pandemic, increasing incidence of HIV/AIDS, and the recent baby food scandal all serve as serious reminders of the complex challenges facing China's health sector and the serious economic, social, and global implications of the system's shortfalls. Now, gradually, China's political leaders were awakened to the fact that in their pursuit of a growth-dominant development agenda, they have neglected the government's responsibilities in adequately financing, delivering, and regulating healthcare. And this neglect, in my view, has resulted in a combination of both government failures and market failures, including runaway medical cost escalation, lack of insurance coverage, and worsening doctor-patient relationships. For example, out-of-pocket medical expenditure has become the #1 poverty generator in many rural areas in China. In certain city hospitals nowadays, the doctors have to wear helmet to work in order to protect themselves from the patient-led violence against them. That's how bad the doctor-patient relationship got. So it is not surprising that the government finally decided to take on its broken healthcare system. It is, however, very interesting, to say the least, to watch how that reform process has been unfolding. 2.5 years ago, September 2006, the State Council formed a national commission called the Healthcare Reform Leadership Group. You see, for those old China hands, you know how the public policy are made today. When they see a policy issue, then they form a small policy study group, either within a ministry or inter-ministry. Then after a period of maybe months of deliberation, they send a report to Wen Jiabao, and Wen Jiabao will sign it and then become a policy. So that leadership group was co-chaired by Ma Kai, the Minister of State Development Reform Commission, and Gao Qiang, the Minister of Health at the time, and now Executive Vice Minister of Health. And as some of you may know, the current Health Minister is Chen Zhu, one of the 2 non-Communist Party members recently appointed to be ministers in China by the Communist Party. It's a story unto itself. Members of this group included senior officials from 16 ministries. After 2.5 years of numerous studies, discussions, debates, and commission studies undertaken by Beijing University, Tsinghua, World Health Organization, NDRC, World Bank, and so on and so forth, this group finally submitted its policy recommendations to Premier Wen Jiabao for his review and approval in the summer of this year. Had it been business as usual, the policy recommendations would have had a smooth ride through the policy bureaucratic process and would have been approved right away and implemented by now. But in this case, the top leadership abandoned its usual practice of allowing a few policy wonks to have the full rein in the final process. On Tuesday, October 14, 2008, the central government of China publicized the draft healthcare plan, pre-announced by Premier Wen Jiabao himself, online, and openly solicited comments and suggestions from the general public. Now, in a nation where political leaders are still chosen by the Communist Party, inviting people to participate in the process of making public policies, at least in the healthcare field, as I know, is completely unprecedented. By the time the government closed this public consultation process, a month later, November 14, 2008, the government's website was already flooded with over 50,000 comments from people from all walks of life, many of whom were very critical of the current healthcare reform plan. As it stands now, the plan calls for establishment of a universal health insurance system by 2020, where every citizen in China will have access to a basic package of services which are, I quote, safe, effective, convenient, and affordable. To achieve this ambitious goal, the plan spells out 21 major policy interventions, including investment, increasing vastly the public investment in public health, expanding insurance coverage, and reforming and strengthening delivery of public health and healthcare services. To many China watchers, this clearly indicates a new determination and dedication on the part of top leadership in China to target healthcare issues as one of the top public policies on their agenda. And this should be warmly welcomed by the Chinese people. However, judging from the comments posted on the web so far, people in China appear to be more critical than grateful. Most of the criticisms focused on, quote unquote, lack of specifics, and the Chinese people are demanding that their political leaders come up with concrete and innovative solutions to achieve the lofty goals of better health care for all. Now, throughout China's long history, as you know, from the ancient feudalism to modern-day dictatorship, Chinese people have been passive victims of bad policies rather than active participants in the policy processes. This passivity was obvious during the misguided cultural revolution of the late 1960s, when tens of thousands of people, including former President Liu Shaoqi, were tortured and killed. The list just goes on and on. So against this historical background, it is quite refreshing and indeed very exciting for me, at least, to watch how the Chinese people, for the first time in a long time, reacted to the opportunity of helping shape the public policies which affect their lives in significant ways. To me, there are two basic ways for people to influence public policy. A, you choose the policymakers through elections, for example. B, you participate in the policy-making process. The defining characteristic of China's healthcare democracy is that people were given a chance to participate in the policy-making process without a voice in the decision regarding who gets to be the policymakers. There might be many different reasons and motives for the Chinese political leaders to initiate this, what I call healthcare democracy at this juncture of time. But the major reason, I suspect, is practical rather than ideological in nature. To be practical is first and foremost to acknowledge that you do not yet know many things you need to know. Yeah? And Deng Xiaoping said it best when he likened the China's reform process to crossing the river by exploring the stepping stones, 摸着石头过河. Yeah? And to me, all the new buzzwords, 以人为本, 科学发展观, people-centered scientific development model for building a harmonious society, reflect an emerging consensus among the Chinese political elites on the need to listen to the people more carefully and to understand the ever-changing world in order to be more effectively govern a large and complex country like China. Perhaps the most prominent manifestation of this perceived need for constant and collective learning can be found in the regular study sessions organized by President Hu Jintao for his Politburo members. Two of my friends who gave lectures to the Politburo members on healthcare reform told me, said basically, Wan Li, I'm surprised by how serious those guys were. They were asking a lot of good questions. So it's not just for political show. There is a general interest in learning, in understanding. Of course, like every experiment, China's current experiment in healthcare democracy might turn out to be less consequential than one would have hoped. Public expectations may be too high to meet, interest groups too diverse to balance. Frustrated by all this, the government may suspend its attempt to include public in future policymaking processes. But if successful, if the process is perceived to be informative with better and new ideas coming out, and if the process can help strengthen the government's legitimacy and the effectiveness to govern by establishing a new image of transparency, I think the experiment could have powerful and positive spillover effects beyond health sector. So like Dr. Josley, I like to end on that optimistic note, of course, always to be corrected by the pessimists in this room. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Edward Cunningham. He's a research fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he tells me soon to be a PhD.
I hope to God. That is out of my hands, unfortunately, but
Are you going to have a PowerPoint?
I actually am.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm going to just...
Let's see here.
I'll give you 5 minutes and 2 minutes.
Okay, all right, great. Exactly. So I think I have the unenviable position of being the final speaker of the day, so I'll try to speak, exactly, I'll try to engage you on questions of energy to make you more energetic. I have already violated one of my cardinal rules, which is to do any presentation of any length with 6 to 7 slides. What I've done here, I have many more slides. I'll probably skip through several of them, but the issue is I've given up probably a good 5 years of my life expectancy doing field work, hanging around Chinese coal mines and electric power and collecting data. So I have this this pressure that I need to share all of my data with all of you. So please forgive this, and I will probably flip through a couple of the slides. But I try to make them more charts and less text-heavy. So this is the only text-heavy slide that I have. And just in case I don't get through all of it, I want to put the 3 points in the beginning. We've talked a lot today about decentralization and re-centralization, and I think that dynamic between the central government, local governments, and increasingly, and what I'll be talking about as well today, corporations. What's been interesting to me, at least, is that often energy as a sector is categorized separately from the discussion. It is viewed very much as a centralized sector, and I'm going to try to push back against that today. And basically make these 3 points. That one, in effect, the majority of China's energy sector has been fairly decentralized, particularly through financial reforms and through ownership, corporate reforms. And that, like in other areas, other sectors of China's economy, has been quite successful, and it's effectively delivered the electrons. You know what? I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to make a change here, because this is the Apple world that I've now entered, and the Apple world somehow seems to change things when you see if I can make view. How do I make zoom actual size? No, it doesn't work. There's probably some way to do this, which I'm now. Is it the bottom? View, full screen mode. Oh, very good. Thank you very much. Good, better. And effectively, that decentralization has led to, continues to lead to dramatic coal, power, oil capacity expansion, new firms, and diversified ownership rights. So that's point number one. So up until now, things have worked. I think this is back to the point that's been made multiple times that in reality, the political economy of China has been fairly successful given the circumstances of the time. But number two, I also want to say that the current and future energy challenges require a somewhat different type of government, effectively a government that has sophisticated regulatory tools to address demand-side needs, not supply-side needs, which is effectively the way the central state has approached the energy issue historically. So there are new firms that have utilized these reforms, these decentralized reforms in corporate and in the financial side of things, and effectively have taken advantage of incredible liberalizations, particularly in the foundation of China's energy sector of coal, upstream, while also trying to negotiate around downstream controls on price that are one of the few areas in which the central state has effectively remained both active and also a bit has re-centralized a bit. That disconnect between upstream liberalization and downstream controls have created considerable inefficiencies, as I think many of you are aware of, but also have muted certain price signals on the industry side that's not only producing but also consuming a lot of energy in China. And the third point is that despite these problems, what we see is effectively an approach, a return in sort of a binary sense from decentralization to re-centralization, and that's in specifically through some of the new institutional actors we see on the energy stage. One of whom is called SASAC, the State Asset Administration Supervision Commission. We have Barry Naughton here, who I hope will jump in as the sort of leading scholar on that issue. And so what I want to end with is to sort of question, number one, whether the decentralized approach that has historically provided the electrons will work moving forward with the demand-side problems that China is facing. And number two, what they actually are doing in terms of re-centralizing, having direct control, ownership control, and appointment control increasingly over these new firms, these new corporations, will address the problems either. It seems to me neither will work. One of the important issues, I think, to get out of the way initially is that there's been a bias, I think, in terms of both the literature and also in terms of about a lot of the punditry surrounding China's energy sector, particularly in the past 5 years, mostly due to the fact that the most international and the most visible aspects of China's energy needs have been on the oil and gas side. I think part of that, of course, is related to the security externalities of those commodities. But another point, of course, is that these firms have gone out and have been involved in significant expansion and investment abroad, and therefore have caught the attention of many observers. But the reality remains that 3/4, and these numbers haven't actually really changed in the past 5 years, 3/4 of China's primary energy consumption, again, primary energy consumption, sort of site energy, primary energy. Site is whatever is on site, so this building uses a certain amount of energy. Primary takes into consideration generation, transmission, sort of the entire envelope. So 3/4 mostly is coal, particularly if you add in electricity. You have 3/4 of energy is in those two sectors. So we need to focus, when you're talking about energy demand growth and supply growth in China, it's quite critical to look at those sectors. And when you do that and you really break it down, you see there are actually really two different worlds in terms of China's energy system and its market. On the one hand, in oil and gas, you have a fairly concentrated market structure. Indeed, in natural gas, you see, despite Zhu Rongji's attempt in 1998, which we can talk about a bit if we want during the Q&A, to effectively create nationally competitive, vertically integrated oil and gas majors that will compete with one another upstream. You actually see natural gas over time more centralization in the sense of a dominance of CNPC as the lead firm. You see a bit of a reduction in CNPC as the lead oil producer, but not considerably. And then you see in dramatic contrast the incredible fragmentation on electric power and particularly in coal. Just to give some on coal, the coal side, to give some type of comparative, the Peabody Energy is the United States' leading coal supplier, and they have about a fifth, 20% of the market in the United States. And that on the coal and the power side, that fragmentation reflects a long-standing reality, and that is that the regulatory apparatus governing China's energy sector has been fragmented historically, and is not simply, this is not a new thing that we see the changing faces and changing institutions, which I'll go through for the past 5 to 10 years. And indeed, there have been many attempts to centralize. There's been this constant awareness that oftentimes the fragmentation and the interests of fragmented actors have been very at variance with the interest of the central state. And I won't go through this, but you had the original centralization right immediately after the founding of the People's Republic. That was then disbanded quite quickly in 2 years. And then we had 4 additional attempts to re-centralize institutionally governance over fairly fragmented sectors. And this is just a notional map to give you an idea of what has occurred over time. And what I find so fascinating is there's what I've been trying to figure out or label as a portfolio approach. There's been an approach of decentralization to this sector that's been effectively nurturing and supporting massive expansion on the supply side through a devolution or decentralization of certain functions. So while you have, over this period, re-centralization, decentralization institutionally, a lot of change there, functionally, you actually see a fairly constant evolution of financial investment. I'll give you some of the data in a bit. Financial investment away from the central state, both towards the local, the provincial government level, state bank level, but also the enterprise level, which is perhaps the most important, meaning state enterprises reinvesting, so money. And the second is ownership. That has been powerful in encouraging a supply-side, upstream liberalized approach to China's energy demand problems. And those policies, we don't have time to go through all of them. I'm using quickly here what happened in electric power to give an example. But over certain periods of time, there was, number one, this financial decentralization. That was both in coal and electric power, and to a certain extent early on actually in oil and gas. That was then rescinded. Where effectively both private, domestic, private foreign, and smaller local state-owned enterprise, state-owned organs, basically of the provincial government, such as investment corporations, provincial investment corporations, were allowed to get into the act effectively to finance what was clearly a vast need in both electric power, coal, and to a certain extent oil and gas build-out that was clearly unable to be done at the central level fiscally in the 1980s. You then have this evolution where you have the separation of business functions from government functions. That was done through not only legal mechanisms, the company law, the electricity law. There is still, it's important to note, the energy law is still being drafted. So again, back to the issue of having an overall regulatory state is, I think, still very problematic. And also then this is the creation of corporations in the 1990s. That was led in particular by Zhu Rongji, who believed that the corporate form would be the most important to improve number one, improve the competitiveness and efficiency. This was the idea at the time of the conversion of China's energy assets. But number two, I think maybe more importantly, separating out more clearly ownership rights over who owned what between the different levels of government and the different private actors and quasi-private actors that were actually involved in that build-out. Lastly, you see this also, particularly in power, there was this attempt to break apart the historical monopolies that you saw in certain aspects of the energy market. And what we see quite clearly in, for example, coal is that reality of over half, in 1978, the beginning of the reform period, over half of coal was produced by the key state enterprise mines, and only a little over 10–15% was produced by township village enterprises and other, mostly private firms. And that has changed to the extent of these township and village enterprise firms, as well as effectively private firms, which I'll show you in a moment, have created effectively over almost half, about half now, of the coal supply. What's also quite interesting is a lot of the incentive there was due to the liberalization of coal pricing, and this is we just completed finally, after a lot of sweat and blood, a electric power survey that looks nationally at lots of different investment decisions of these firms. And what's quite interesting is you see in black the U.S. delivered price of coal to power plants, and in red spot prices, blue contract prices, a considerable considerable variation in what's being paid in terms of power plants in China, but B, considerably higher coal prices that are being paid in China in terms of the delivered plant. All this has resulted in diversification of ownership. You have, by 2005, you only have half effectively of the sales income being generated by the SOEs, meaning the key state-owned enterprise mines. You have joint shareholder, private, and other, which is effectively township and village enterprises, and also a whole different subsector or subcategories of joint shareholder firms that effectively make up half of the coal produced. You don't just see this in coal. You also see diversification of ownership in power generation. The big five that were the old state power corporation have only 42% or so of China's power capacity. Local governments are critical in providing power, 40% or so there. Foreign and private were at one point were brought in the mid 1990s, early 1990s, have reduced in their importance. And this is complicated, but worth just spending a moment on. On the financial side, that diversification has been quite considerable, particularly on the enterprise level. So what I did was, in 1980, you can see clearly the importance of central transfers in building out China's power sector. But if you take and I'm trying to stack the deck against myself and not show you 2007, which is a very different story, but 1949 to 2007, the cumulative impact of diversification, you see over a quarter of investments have been through the enterprises themselves, foreign funds, and other, meaning mostly provincial, at the provincial level. That has created this build-out. The build-out has been massive in absolute terms. I mean, 102 gigawatts, for example, in electricity, 2006, about 90 in 2007. That's the size of France, a little bit less than Germany. If you look at the curve regionally, sort of in comparative terms, the curve is determined by China effectively. And we have these reforms effectively resulting in these new corporate actors, and these corporate actors have been listed effectively. They've diversified not only their assets, but they've moved a certain amount of assets around even internationally. But the problem has been, of course, now looking forward, there are some considerable issues in terms of China's, what the supply focus has led to significant efficiency issues. And just to make it clear, China effectively, in order to produce a quarter of the United States output, China requires 3/4 of the U.S. input. So you see, this is mostly due to an industry bias, of course, in terms of China's economic structure. And you see this from over time an increasing actual consolidation of industry as a fraction. You add to that, which was touched on today, moving forward, that inefficiency issue plus the household, the incredibly historically low share of household consumption that will continue to grow. I think it's fascinating to me how China doubled its urban ratio in the past 20 years or so, from 1985 to 2005, and that was basically double the rate that the region took to do the same. And what I'll do is to me it's quite interesting on the oil side, which we can also discuss. 2%. This is in 2003. It's doubled now. 4% of China's total oil is consumed by personal cars. Comparably, the United States about 28-30%. There's effectively two ways of looking in conclusion at this. One is that when you step back, China again has done quite well. It is effectively one of the most self-sufficient nations on earth in terms of energy at this point. And as a result, one would think it has certain options. But it's now dealing with demand-side issues with a central state, a regulatory state that has been incredibly diminished in both manpower and in both institutional effectiveness, despite this incredible diversification on the corporate side. This is just some quick comparatives to give you an idea of the numbers. And lastly, what we see, so in terms of trying to deal with this issue on the demand side, is this creation of a new entity, and this new entity is effectively attempting to increase through dividends, through investment approval, is direct management of these assets. And so the last question that I leave you with is, number one, can a decentralized approach, this approach that has worked well effectively for China in the past to deal with supply side issues, can that be used to shift China away from its dependence on coal in the broader scheme and a highly inefficient supply side. That's number one. Number two is the approach that they're currently taking to increase direct involvement through state ownership in this sector. Will that be able to effectively deal with these issues? I would argue no. We can maybe talk about it in discussions, and that's it. Out of time. I don't know if I can close this, but.
We'll leave it up just in case.
Okay, sure.
Some people may want it. So I guess Joe has asked me to say a couple of words, and believe me, that's about all I'll be able to say, because this discussion is a bit out of the range of whatever background I have. But I would caution one thing. I confess to only sitting here one session, but it seems like a lot of the discussion, at least in this session, has centered around issues of efficiency. And I think a lot of the issues that confront China are issues of scale. And just to give you the difference in the effectiveness of those two issues, I would quote an idea from Herman Daly, who talked about the idea of an economic Plimsoll line. And the idea is traditional economics is very much focused on efficiency gains. And so if you look at a ship has a line on it that tells you how much cargo you can put on that ship. And from an efficiency perspective, there are different ways to stack materials on a ship such that you can really maximize the amount of cargo you can get on that ship before it goes under. But what economics is not good at, what efficiency considerations are not good at, are issues of scale. That is, there is a limit to how much stuff you can put on that boat, regardless of how efficiently you stack it. And given China's size and given its anticipated growth, I just feel like a lot of the energy challenges it's going to face, a lot of the environmental challenges that are going to be faced, have to deal with scale, the absolute quantities of materials being consumed. And just to bring it back to what I heard people talking about today, at some level, those are issues that are best addressed by centralized governments as opposed to decentralized governments. So with that said, I now feel like that and keeping people to 15 minutes, I've fulfilled my role, and so I would turn it.
Role, which is to field the question.
Well, I was going to say I'll turn that role over to Lindsay now, who will bring the mic around, and my understanding is we'll ask 2 or 3 questions, ask for responses, and then repeat that process. So please, if you have questions for any of the speakers, please start.
If I understood correctly, you said that China was very self-sufficient in energy. But when it makes this shift away from coal, isn't that going to change? And what do you see on the horizon and the implications for China both internationally and domestically?
Question for Professor Zheng. You mentioned about selective centralization, and by selective, I assume that you are thinking of central government. So central government is selecting the areas of recentralization. So I want to know what do you think is the criteria or the underlying rationale for central government's selection of areas of recentralization, and also by selective, you mean central government's will or intention is very important or crucial or is determining. But we know that in several aspects of public service, for example, in public security, there are attempts or voice by central government to centralize, but it's not successful. So my question would be, how do you think of the local government's resistance to this re-centralization? And also another question, you mentioned about the solution for the struggle between central government and local government is to empowering the society. And you also mentioned about the party state continues to be resistant to the social forces. So my question would be, what do you think would motivate or give the incentives for the party state to be willing to empower the social forces? Thank you.
I have a question for Professor Liu Yanli. The story you told certainly added a lot of weight to what Jamie talked about, the whole transparency of how certain policy is going to be made. But my question to you is, to what extent, this whole thing is motivated by the top leaders in terms of getting popular input into the process, or it is just a matter of 16 ministries getting involved in this whole thing that really don't know how to deal with it, and try to just if you're considering September 2006 to now, if this is something of dire urgency, it takes so long for them to come up with a policy. And then you think it took about 2 weeks for Wen Jiabao and everybody else to come up with a $500 billion bailout plan. It's, I don't understand. So my question to you is this really something exciting about a democracy, transparent process of policy making, or this is just the government not paying really attention, as many scholars argue today? They really don't care about people's need. They care more about growth.
Okay, I ask a question. As you said, all the people are complaining the Chinese health policy. However, you said due to the huge population and the available the budget for the health investment is limited. And so I ask you, what's your opinion about it? What's the priority the government should do to coverage, cover the population? Is prevention or treatment? Coverage is a major disease or mild disease? And the second question is, in which field the government take a role, control the investment? What government role in this improve the efficiency of this cost, to control the cost of treatment, and what should left to the market regulation? So some people said the public health or the health administration is a policymaker and a policy practitioner. So is any other party can involve in this control the investment? Okay, thank you.
Okay, why don't we give the speakers a chance to answer the questions, and then we'll invite a second round. Does anybody want to start?
Okay. Well, two questions for me about. First of all, about the selective centralization that I referred to the Zhu Wenji's reform. I think and Zhu Wenji was quite rational, and he did not want to have a full-scale centralization. So he selected like taxation reform, which is very important. Also, central bank system. Those are basic state institutions, what the China side call. And later on, but actually under Wu Jintao and Wen Jiabao decentralization quite different, quite full scale. And also the central government becomes so greedy, where wherever it become profitable, the central government will go. So the central government doesn't necessarily doesn't want to take responsibility, as you mentioned, in the public security, all kind of things. They don't want to bear any responsibility. That's the major issue. People will say, well, the central government only takes, right? You never gives. That's the problem, huge gap. That's also makes local government to perform very difficult to perform their function. So that's the way. About the social force, I think somehow, and that now so far as I mentioned, I described, China has a policy deadlock because we see and at the top, those 9 members of the standing committee of the pro-below, they have a de facto veto power to each other because each neighbor has the system of so-called division labor. So division labor. So each guy, focus on is barely responsible for a field. So in that field, and he has a final say. So that means even Wu Jintao, Wen Jiabao do not have power over those fields. So this morning, Joe talked about elite politics. I think there's a big change now. For example, on the Deng Xiaoping, and Chen Ying, of course, could have a voice, but Zheng Ying definitely cannot veto Deng Xiaoping's decision. But now, and those even like Hou Guoqian and in charge of security, and he can veto even Wu Jintao's policy preference. That's a totally different situation. So social force, I would say, will come to play a more important role. For example, when Wu and Wu Jintao, when Jiabao came into power, because they lacked of legitimacy, so they had to appeal to people, assault populism. But they, nevertheless, of course, they are half-hearted, populist, because it's very difficult. When social force will mobilize, that will be difficult to control. So later on, of course, initially they mobilized social force and gain their popularity, popular support. It was very strong. Without those, the strong public support, I don't think Wu could survive even, and especially when Jiabao, because you have a SARS event, you have all kind of things. So, but I think very limited, and the people actually when first time when Jiabao cried, people felt, wow, this it's a good guy. But when then you cry too many times, then people doesn't count. So, well, China actually, that's. I would say this leadership is so weak even compared to Jiang Zemin's leadership. So that means they have to go to open the process to the people. Otherwise, I would say, continuous decline of central power, despite the all kind of effort in centralization.
Well, the big question about what issues the top policymakers will take on and how quickly they announce, develop, and implement policy, I think determined or influenced by two considerations. One is the urgency of the issue, and the other is complexity of the issues. SARS, definitely is a very urgent issue, but it was very simple. So you have to quarantine people and so on, and hold all the government officials accountable for undercovering any cases and so on. So immediately the government took action and swiftly brought the crisis under control. And whether health system deficiencies urgent problem. It's definitely urgent issues in the eyes of the people, and opinion polls after poll, people identify a lack of healthcare access as one of the major social concerns. But you see, most of the political elites and the economic powerfuls got the health insurance coverage. So it's really the major urgent issues of the powerless and the voiceless. And so I would speculate that may be one of the reasons why the deliberation process took so long, not as urgent, quickly action to be taken as we would have hoped. But I would say probably this prolonged process of deliberation is more constrained by the comprehensive understanding of the complexity of the issues. I mean, if you think healthcare reform is easy, then you would have expected Hillary Clinton would have done it, and Obama wouldn't put it as a campaign issues in this country, right? It's very complicated, especially in a physically decentralized country like China. Who should, pay for whatever package come up, the role of the central government and the local government, the role of the market and the government, how you invest in prevention or treatment or both. All those issues, I think the 16 ministries, they all share the aspiration, and the common goal of, reforming the system, make it better for everyone. But I think there are really divergent views and different opinions about the approaches and the ways to go forward. For example, the Ministry of Health is very much in favor of adopting a UK-like system where the government plays a much more significant role than currently it has been in both financing and providing healthcare. After all, 93% of the hospital beds are operated by the government hospitals. So it's a private finance system, but publicly delivered system, and the Ministry of Health wants to get more subsidies to the supply side. Meanwhile, the Social Security Ministry and the Ministry of Finance want to subsidize the demand side by establishing a health insurance, a hybrid of social and commercial insurance. So, you know, there are different views. And also, I think a much more difficult issue is with the intergovernment relationship. As Professor Zheng alerted earlier, there is some selective re-centralization effort. But in my experience of working in health policy making area, I would hesitate to characterize either decentralization or re-centralization. I think the different levels of government are struggling to come up with a more effective formula for collaboration. You know, for someone who have worked in rural health insurance area for many, many years, and I'm proud to have been able to make some contributions, influencing policy making end of 2002 by Jiang Zemin to really make rural health insurance a top issue. And the effective formula there we came up with and was accepted by the government is the matching funding idea. Is that, okay, this is an issue not just for the central government, but for everybody in this. So the central government will put up a seed money, premium subsidies to be matched by each and every levels of the government. Now you may say, how about the poor? Yeah, okay, the poor through transfer payment. You know, so that's an example of how complicated, you know, the issue. It's not just say, okay, government will really increase responsibility, but which government are you talking about, you know? And which government agencies are you talking about, the Ministry of Health or Finance or Social Security? So I would suggest that both the urgency consideration as well as complexity may be behind what we are observing.
Let me do one thing. I'm dying to get this last one, but I just have to. So just to the question about energy self-sufficiency, because I always try to stay away from the word independence. I think on one side there's recognition that it will be virtually impossible, given the transportation growth that is already happening and scheduled or estimated to happen in China, that oil and gas will be able to be met domestically. So you have, I think it's 3.9 or something million barrels per day by next decade. That will be the sort of topping out rate for China. And that's again due to some inefficiency issues in terms of the way it's pulled out of the ground. The IEA, I think it was 2 years ago, so it's fairly conservative, looked at by 2030 the need. So 3.9 is the topping out. The need will be 12 to 13 million barrels per day. Oil is gas is even less apparent in that sense. So oil and gas will be unquestionably that quarter. That quarter.
Is something you need to pick apart to look at it, because on your charts it was gas that was teeny tiny compared to the world, and oil and gas are not the same thing. And I was thinking specifically of the pipeline that keeps getting rumored from Russia.
That's right. So, but what I'm saying is, but even oil and gas put together, so that is about a quarter of China's energy system, right? So I think there's a recognition that those will not be will not be met. Those needs will not be met internally effectively. Right? That will be through trade. The big issue is the 75%. How will that be met? And there's two ways that it's being thought of. One is you have simply more coal, and because renewables, I wanted to have Joanna here because it would be interesting to go through this, but you have renewables that even nuclear, with its sort of revamped investment, will probably be 4 or 5% of total energy needs by 2020, even if they meet their targets. So you have more coal, or you have efficiency investments, right? The problem that I see is that on the efficiency side, you have this supply focus, which means 3 BTU is necessary input in coal for 1 BTU output in electric power. If you're always focusing on the 3 BTU, you're missing the fact that to really get the major decreases, you need to have that 1 BTU output. That's what's got to be reduced, not the 3 that's going in. The problem there, and this just gets back to the slide, is what's happened up until now is there's been these policies upstream of liberalizing coal have created enough incentive for for example, in power, for big companies to say, coal is such a big part of our cost that we're going to increase, we're going to invest in technology that's much higher steam parameters, meaning much more efficient, right? On the left is low, on the right is high. You see over time, more and more bars are on the right-hand side. So there has been an investment in equipment because of a market approach, a liberal upstream approach, response. The problem is these plants also in this survey had an enormous rates of sulfur emissions, for example, right? So they're not often, that market solution means that they're under such profit constraints that they're not operating the flue gas desulfurization and other equipment. So a market solution, yes, worked to a certain extent to solve some of these efficiency issues on the supply side, but in terms of the demand side, what you see in China in terms of the need for power, the need for coal, and also the environmental impacts, that really has not been touched. And so that to me is the big problem, is you either have more coal or you have or higher efficiency investments. And so far, those efficiency investments have been on the supply side. So I think in the end, the self-sufficiency argument is going to be incredibly powerful, will continue to be powerful, and you'll probably have more coal. So I would question the assumption when you start off, you said, less coal, therefore China will need to be more dependent on the world. I think they will be more dependent on the world for oil and gas. I'm not sold on the idea that they will have less coal.
Another round of questions.
I'm just wondering if you could say something about the prospects for coal gasification and improved cleaner coal, since coal looks inevitable.
I just wanted to also have the panel sort of play with the stimulus package that we're seeing. So sort of if each of you could put on your own lenses on how you see that stimulus package actually getting implemented. What are the ramifications, who wins, who loses across each of your sort of areas of expertise? And in particular, just sort of a pet thing that I'm interested in, if you could talk to specifically SASAC and sort of how that plays out and how much of that fiscal stimulus goes through SASAC or finds its way into SASAC's coffers or ends up in other parts of the economy.
I'd like to ask a question about the political economy of China and how that's changed over time. It seems to me that in the 1980s, China was able to align what the central government wanted to do with the incentives, the interests of local elites. And in a sense, that's why agriculture and industrialization and so forth worked so well in the 1980s. As you get into the 1990s and early this century, as Barry pointed out in his presentation, some of the state-owned companies are getting very wealthy. And that certainly is true in the oil and energy sector. And if you look at sort of membership of the Central Committee, you see the heads of all the major corporations, Sinopec, PetroChina, everybody is there. And, an old Guomindang specialist says, I know what this is. This is a bureaucratic capitalism, being, historical patterns. And even Liu Yanlian talking about the liberation on healthcare says, well, the central policymakers had healthcare, so it wasn't really all that urgent of a problem. It seems like this is a real problem that China is facing in the determination of policy, the ability of the government to implement that policy against perhaps certain interests. I think Ed had a slide that went by kind of quickly, but if I saw it, there were in the NDRC energy sector, there are 100 or so specialists who are supposed to be telling these big Sinopec executives who are much better connected politically than they are what to do. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really worried about the sort of the political economy of China changing in ways that deform policy making and the ability to implement policy. So I hope you deflect my concerns.
Why don't we go to the right side of the room?
I would just like to ask a question about China's response to America's or the developed nations discourse on emissions, greenhouse gases, global warming, it appears as though China's growth of coal consumption is an indication that they don't care. I was interested in what you see as China's perspective is on this subject.
Professor Zheng, you suggested that the state-society decentralization can be a solution to the problem China faces right now. I'm wondering if we can look at the decentralization as a process instead of either or. Basically, I'm wondering if you can assess at what stage China is during this state-society decentralization, considering there is quite a lot of active NGO activities during the earthquake and especially in the environmental field. So I wonder if we can tie this with the democratization theory. For example, if there's a consolidation stage, or if we can categorize it in specific stages and where you see China is during that process.
Okay, why don't we give people a chance to answer? Because we've got 8 minutes left, so if there's time, we can answer.
I think about the stimulus package, and in my view, I don't think this package is going to work. I would say most of money will go to infrastructure building, like Zhong Ji did after the 1997 financial crisis, and basically Zhong Ji failed to increase domestic consumption. But this time again, I would say all local government actually will do and put money into infrastructure, airport and railway, and I don't think much money will go to like healthcare and education because there's no incentive at all. For example, and for local government do not have incentive to improve local health because those local government officials, they already benefit. They already have receiving very wonderful and healthcare packages. So why they put money into the people? So I would say, well, yes, infrastructure building, yes, but it will not do this social security net. It will not. About the NGOs, I think China is still a very early stage of NGO development, and if NGOs are helpful for the government, as a helpful hand, that's the government will say, you do that, you encourage. Whatever, when NGO come to like, as I mentioned, the politically sensitive issues, then an NGO, the government discourages and even control that. So it's a bit nothing to do with democracy, really. I don't say NGO here can play a role of promote Chinese democratization. That's quite different because the government just want to shift its responsibility to some NGOs for social development, charity and social development. I don't say the government has an intention to use to encourage NGO for political liberalization. That's, I think, quite maybe totally different matters. For Jews, the question, I think I have a point. I think yes, and in the 80s, and decentralization was very effective to provide the local government incentive to promote economic development. But not now, as I mentioned, actually a lot of tension between local government and central government. Local government really at this time feel very bad. And SOEs, like energy companies, and a lot complain from society because they can decide their own price and they decide their own wage level, and because those public money their decision do not subject to any political organization or social forces. So that's so local government now. In the 80s, local government was quite rich on the 赵紫阳, and people would say 藏富于地方, like you keep wealth in the hand of local government officials. So they have money, they had the money as incentive to promote local growth. But this time, they're very, very difficult to do so because most money, as I mentioned, go to the central government. if you go to like central and inland China, all those local governments are so poor. So that's a very strange phenomenon. You know, a lot of local governments are trying to be, how to categorize into the poverty, like county and the 穷县, because they can get help from the central government. That's totally different picture from the 80s.
Well, a caveat about the current stimulus package, like an old saying goes, rising tide will help raise every boat. I do have reasons to believe that there are going to be some trickle-down effects on the currently helpless people and underinvestment area, including healthcare. Yesterday, I was just done with a senior health executive training for a group of 40 national and provincial health leaders. And clearly, during the last days of their being here, I saw how busy they are preparing their plans to be submitted to the central government for funding as a part of the stimulus package, including infrastructure in poor rural areas, the clinics and ambulances and all of those things. So in the name of stimulating economic growth, I think the health sector will also benefit, maybe not as a primary intention of the package. Now, a tougher question, Joe, you raised is really what does the political elite, the party, represent? Jiang Zemin said 3 represents, right? Well, all those slogans aside, I think we probably should look at the question of what their embedded self-interest and incentive structures the political leaders faced. Of course, people placed a lot of hope on the tendency of current Hu and the Wen administration to develop more people-centered policies, citing their extensive working experiences in Tibet and Guizhou and those poor rural areas rather than Shanghai and those. But I would always caution that assertion by pointing out that look at what businesses the sons and daughters of the top political leaders in China are engaged in. Yeah, well, it's not to say that they do not represent the people. But I think even out of the motivation to protect their own interests, I have reasons to hope that the equity aspect of the development will be enhanced for 2 reasons. One, because of their families, stakeholders of the economy now, the top leaders and their families have something to lose, okay? And they are very, very motivated to develop rule of law, all the new regulations, including private property protection, all those things, which are really a fundamental fabric of a civil society, democracy, everything else. Second, they also realized they cannot getting rich first forever, you know, without concerning about the possible uprising, rebellion, and the social unrest because of the ever-increasing gaps between the haves and the have-nots. So I think not so much out of the new ideological orientation, but even from the point of view of the necessity of protecting their own family interests, they probably will be also amenable to a more equity-oriented development agenda.
I guess my quick responses are that in terms of the stimulus package, I guess 2 things. One is the people at SASAC that I speak to talk about how they view the argument to be for they're propounding arguments for railway investments that are going to improve the ability because so much of 63% of the portfolio is energy related. That will increase the ability to move energy assets nationally. So when they one of the big issues is bottlenecks for rail. So the idea is a lot of potential is not being met domestically because of that inability of the rail to move coal. I think there is a lot to that. Part of the survey we did looks at that, and there has been a shift, at least in our sample, towards trucks. So one aspect is that for them, I think they're a bit, people within the entity are thinking more narrowly. But in terms of the larger, I guess I'm a bit skeptical, because I remember getting all excited. I think it was in Liz Perry's class, actually, in 2000, excited about Develop the West. And I thought, I was saying, this makes sense. This is exactly what China needs. It needs it for the domestic consumption issue and balancing. And effectively, what I think we saw with that was the localization of a lot of those funds to, not to infrastructure, but to sectors that were in the interest of the local government, and oftentimes, at least some of the projects I looked at, were effectively not even built. So that to me kind of has tempered my excitement over the fiscal stimulus. And we can argue whether this is a different world and different needs, but I'm more skeptical. Joe, your point is well taken. For me, it's fascinating, and then the energy side, because I've seen you have meetings where you have regulators from the central government who are effectively engineers, who are very smart but trained as engineers and look at sort of energy issues technically. And then on the other side, you have individuals, and Ed Steinfeld at MIT has done a lot of work on this. You have individuals who effectively worked at Goldman Sachs or worked at Enron or worked at Chevron or Exxon, who have now moved back and are now in the state-owned enterprise, particularly on the oil and gas side, and they have the knowledge, the financial networks, and the ability to construct deals that are so much more complex on the global side that they effectively are shaping off in the discussion. So you see that on the ground. Part of me, so you can easily look at that and say, then you're having a corporate-led expansion, and we all know how evil corporations are, and their interests are so different. Part of me, though, is a bit, in a sense, hopeful that, at least in the United States, one of the corollaries historically is you saw in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before the New Deal, you did see one of the important aspects or one of the important motivations for nationalizing regulations or effectively implementing nationally was the most mobile industries like shipping, transportation, and energy, that those firms, as they became cartelized and as they their scale improved or increased, they needed to reduce transaction costs across, I think it was like 36 states at the time, and they wanted to have a homogeneous regulation. So in one sense, perhaps these corporations will eventually push for that type of a national strengthening. The last two questions, one was about gasification, and yes, so there's a lot happening there. There's actually many Massachusetts companies that are now moving to China. One's called Great Point. Many people should go talk to them. They're quite interesting. I think there's a lot going on, but most of that's being used for peaking power. So there's just a limit in terms of how much is going to be used. The other side of it is liquefaction of coal. So they're for fuel purposes, but there I think most of the water needs that are necessary at this point, because there's not recycling technology, as far as I understand, the water needs have tamped down the interest in liquefaction. So I think, in general, coal and the multiple uses of coal, liquefaction, gasification, are fairly limited moving forward, although there's a lot being done in absolute numbers. In terms of the country, their impact is not going to be that large, I think. Lastly, do they care? I think if you look at it, local governments do. So you have certain coastal municipalities that have effectively taken advantage of the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. Everyone makes, I think, quite a big deal about the fact that the Clean Development Mechanism market is half of it is China. From what I've seen, at least from what I understand, most of that has this additionality issue, which is that they're effectively projects that were already going to be built anyway, number one. So they're not really shifting investment, forms of investment. And number two, a lot of them are going into small hydro, which is, I think, effectively localizing a lot of externalities, negative externalities, actually to China's, to the cost of China, and to the benefit, arguably, of the world. But I think, again, a lot of these are being built anyway. So locally, there's some movement there, but the biggest example is CDM. I'm not sure it's really having the impact people are talking about. At the central level, I think there's still a belief, despite the white papers that are produced, a belief that this sort of traditional approach that should be tech transfer based. That's why I think one individual this morning talked about this global fund that's been raised by Beijing. I think that's the idea. Is it's this this sort of traditional idea that a lot of the technology and the know-how needs to be transferred effectively for free to China, and I think that's running into significant opposition.
Do we have more questions? We have time for second round. I know you had your hand up when I cut you off last time.
Hi, I have a healthcare question. Last time I was in China, one thing that really struck me was how many people there smoke cigarettes everywhere you look. And like, for example, I went rock climbing once, and people were climbing, smoking cigarettes. The guy that was belaying me was smoking a cigarette. I even heard a rumor that in the Ministry of Health, they're smoking inside. So I kind of think to my grandparents' generation in the States, who are supposed to be the big smoking generation here, and I wonder, what's going to happen to China? And is there anything we can learn from the United States' experience?
Okay. We have talking about the government investment in healthcare, but my question is how to control the medical treatment cost efficiently. Because at the moment, clearly, the medical insurance policy seems failure, like UK or United States. The cost of medical treatment is so high. If the cost of medical treatment in China like this, the government will get bankruptcy. So, what's your opinion about how control the medical treatment cost in China efficiently? Okay, thank you.
Are there?
Why don't you just do those two and if else not back?
Okay. Okay, so please answer.
For Professor Jordan.
Yeah.
If you ask me what's the single most important public health issue in China, it's smoking. China is the largest producer as well as consumer of tobacco products in the world. And smoking kills about 1 million people a year. So that's really put the other causes of death pale compared in this. Internationally, there are just two major strategies, effective, proven strategies. One is education. The other is increasing cigarette tax. Education, long process. China still has a long way to go. And we have to change the smoking behavior starting from the top, including the chain smoker health minister. And one shocking statistic is that over half of the Chinese doctors are smokers. So how can you educate your patients to quit smoking when you set a very bad example? So I would not place a high hope on that. But globally, it has proven very effective if you can increase the prices through increased cigarette tax, and some people even call it the sin tax. That will kill two birds. One, you have more money to finance healthcare for the poor, for public health, for prevention, for smoking cessation, so on. And number two, to help reduce the demand, especially the young people who are demand elasticity is very high. So I'm happy to report that I recently just got a Bloomberg grant to work with the Chinese Ministry of Finance to study the political feasibility and the concrete steps that China need to take to increase cigarette tax. And we're hopeful that at the end of the 2 year of this study cycle, we will be seeing a new policy implemented, overcoming the hurdle. As you may know, cigarette tax is one of the biggest sources of government revenue in China. Over 10% of total government revenue came from cigarette tax. So we are working with the government to see how the revenue situation will not adversely affect it while we can increase in cigarette tax as a policy, public health, as well as a poverty reduction issue. Now, you are concerned about further medical cost escalation, I think, is very much warranted, given that the rapid expansion of health insurance coverage may help exacerbate that problem. Now, to solve that problem, I think you need to answer the question as every good doctor would: what's the root causes of the cost escalation? Of course, there are other major explanatory factors, including aging of the population, technology diffusion. But one of the most critical factors underlying the cost escalation in China is the economists called induced demand on the part of the doctors. And that is a direct result of the distorted pricing policy in China. The prices of medical care are still set by the government, the SDRC. Yeah, everything else is subject to the demand and supply forces, not healthcare. So the prices of medical services in China is set below cost artificially by the government. Now, in order to make the hospitals and doctors ends meet, they allow them to charge a markup for every drug, 15% of retail over wholesale for every drug they prescribe. So you can imagine what a strong financial incentive under that system. So basically, in my view, every doctor and hospital in China, I don't care whether private or public, under that system have become a drug peddler. Okay, that's because that's the major source of income. So in order for China to bring the cost escalation under control, China has to reform its distorted pricing system. The prices of medical services should go up, and the prices of retail should come down. And only by separating dispensing from prescribing can China have the hope to control medical costs. Otherwise, it just won't work.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the panel for their participation and the audience for your questions. Thank you very much. And then we'll get a few words from Joe.
Just a few?
Just a few.
Because there's so little left to be said. It's rare that you come to an end of a conference and feel that all the questions have been answered. Well, maybe not all of them. But in any case, I think that we have been like Lei Feng, that we have overachieved our goals. It has been a wonderful conference. And I just on behalf of Boston University, the Pardee Center, and myself, I'd like to thank all the participants and the audience for coming. It's been a great day. Thank you very much. I was just going to say the reason that Adel Najam was not yet back here to say his closing remarks was because he's a teacher. And at BU, all of our teachers, like Lei Feng, work overtime, and he has been tending to his good students and just made it back.
Thank you, Joe. I won't add a lot beyond promising that I will see the last session on tape. That's the other good thing about having it on tape. But yes, I was tending to my good students, even the not so good students. I try to tend to. Not that we have too many of those. But once again, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone for being here, for certainly the parts I saw, and I'm very, very sure the parts that I missed, a wonderful set of discussions. I have actually had the pleasure of reading all of the papers now, as has Georgia and many others. And they really are a very good set of papers. And I say that as a non-China specialist. So if I could understand them and get excited about them, I'm sure those of you who study it. So we are all very much looking forward to the next iteration of these papers, to the book coming soon to a bookshop near you. But really my job is here to thank all of you for making a wonderful conference and for being here, and to thank Joe again for all his hard work. Thank you.